Welcome back with a smiling face. Links to previous episodes are given in the video description, so don't forget to like, subscribe and share the video. Echoes of Shattered Destiny. Episode 16. Chapter 117 to 125. It's happening again. Sean frowned, emerging from Claire's kitchen with a plate of sandwiches in his hand and a bag of chips in the other. Sean looked better than he had these last few weeks. He was eating again, and the dark circles around his eyes had faded almost completely. Moving on from a fallen mate was impossible, but finding a way to live despite the pain, only the strongest could do such a thing. He took a seat beside Dad on the couch, setting the plate on the table for the two of them. Dad and Sean needed to keep their hands busy when they were stressed. It was exactly why Grandma was out back right now, pruning Claire's rose bush. I knew she was listening in on us, because every so often she'd throw a comment of her own through the sliding glass door. The breeze that wafted through was pleasant, at least. Even though the room was heavy with emotion. Exactly like the first time. Dad questioned, his eyes flitting to me. I had come clean about the notes I was getting from Tyler, and how he had confronted me that day at my secret swimming hole. This was all before his DH, which begged the question. Who was doing this? Not exactly. The DH is the same. Just as gruesome. I swallowed, but it did nothing to ease the knot in my chest. It brought back that photo, the one where Carson and I had posed like long-lost friends. It's the details that changed. Like the note and picture at the crime scene, that was new. Last time this happened, Tyler and the Vampire King were behind it. Seeing as how they're both long confirmed, they aren't responsible. That leaves the witches, or the vampires against Lola. Zeke chimed in, his playful mood non-existent. The sly glint in his eyes had long ago turned dull, souring until only guilt filled them. As those eyes met my own, I knew the same light shined in my own. I had been posing with her for several minutes, and in all that time, I hadn't felt anything out of the ordinary. There had been dozens of drunken college students watching us, eyeing the popular sorority girl and their Luna. It had been my brief association with her that got her KD, but it was Zeke who had seen her last, who had watched as she got into an Uber and headed back to the lake in search of her cell phone. We're striving for peace, Lola. There are always going to be vile people who want to destroy that. They'll do whatever it takes to get their way, but that's when we need to stand strong, not back down. What happened wasn't your fault, and we're going to do everything in our power to make sure what happened to Carson doesn't happen again. Maddox's voice was the last thing I had expected, his raspy voice swirling through my head. I felt my throat constrict as I registered his words, my eyes darting to where he stood against the kitchen doorway. Even as everyone talked, his gaze remained trained on me, on every movement or expression I made. Did either of you see anything, hear anything out of the ordinary? Killian asked. His dark hair was longer than Maddox's, but just as untidy from the number of times he ran his fingers through it. Claire sat stone-faced at his side, a hand on his bicep. While I was at the party, no. There were just a bunch of students, nothing more. There was some drunk AE that tried to pick a fight Devon, I think, but I doubt a college frat boy is our MR. I replied, looking into Maddox's golden-flecked eyes. What about you? Did you feel anything off when you went after Zeke last night? Devon Armstrong. Killian grimaced, eyes passing between me and his son. He's Judge Clint's son. Causes him some trouble every now and again, but the boy wouldn't MR someone. Not with Clint breathing down his neck. I went straight to the after-party looking for Zeke, then the nearest police station when a pack member told me he had been arrested. Maddox's baritone filled the room, always robbing me of breath. Third and fourth shift patrol teams were switching out the time of her DH, but neither saw anything. Your sister, the nightmares she's been having. Is there any chance they could tie into this? What about Tristan and his vampire connections? They have to know something. Zeke asked, pulling my attention away from Maddox. His eyes were dark with shadows, that only he could banish. The same ones that still haunted me after Mason's mate's DH. I didn't take it personally when his voice turned hard. If there is a chance, we owe it to Carson to find out. She's your sister, and she has been through a lot in her short life, but this is bigger than that. If she knows something about Carson's DH, or how to prevent any more, we need to know. Maddox was first to break the silence since we had left Zeke and the others, on our way to see if Holly knew anything about last night. Zeke had been right, and so had Maddox, even though my chest ached at the thought of upsetting Holly. Part of me had been excited for a sister, and still was, but now all I wanted was for her to get better. To taste sunlight and freedom after years in the dark. Brianna, Giovanni, and Tristan were all at the house when we arrived. The first vampire had been sleeping peacefully, until Brianna padded upstairs to wake him up. The second, who peered at me with pale eyes, leaned against the kitchen counter. You woke me up with your panicking earlier, Tristan remarked dryly. I jumped a good inch as Maddox's snarl crackled beside me, the once empty house filled with hostility and aggression. The hand I placed on his arm only did so much to curb his rage. At the very least, it kept him from lunging at Tristan. A girl was MD last night. His voice still oozed malice, but at least it was contained. I gave him a warning glance as he took a step towards Tristan. It's pretty convenient the details of her MR match up to the ones in Lola's old pack. Remember them? The innocent werewolves that you helped KL. The last thing I felt like doing was breaking up a fight between an alpha and a vampire, but I wasn't going to let them KL one another. Not when I needed their help figuring all of this out. I'll never deny my part or what I've done. My mistakes will follow me to my DH, but I know what side I'm on now and who I support. Doubt me again, and enough. You're both arguing like children. I snarled, jabbing a finger into Maddox's chest when he opened his mouth to snap back at Tristan. I looked into my mate's eyes, seeing, and understanding the anger and fierce protectiveness that lived there. It leached some of the harshness out of my voice. We can pick this argument up after we figure out who MD Carson. I know you're angry right now, but fighting one another is a waste of our time. The anger that turned the air thick and humid fizzled out when Giovanni emerged from upstairs, followed by Brianna. His curly hair was messy from sleep, even though his dark eyes were bright and alert. Someone was MD? Brianna asked, her eyes wide as she paused at the top of the stairs. It took 10 minutes to explain what happened to the three of them. The only one unable to hide their reaction was Brianna, who grew paler with each gruesome detail. I held back a laugh-turned-sob when she flung her arms around my neck. If my balance wasn't so good from training, I would have tumbled backwards. Oh, Lola! That's so horrible to hear. She frowned, pulling back after a few long seconds. You know this isn't your fault, right? So Maddox keeps reminding me. My smile was brittle, turning towards Giovanni and Tristan. Think any of your contacts will know about this AK? I'm still in touch with a few families that haven't chosen a side. If this was the work of vampires, I have a feeling they might know who. Getting them to tell, that will be the fun part. Tristan replied, his angular jaw still clenched. He brushed a strand of his now short hair out of his face, his eyes the color of storm clouds. It'll take me some time to get a hold of them. They're trying to stay off the grid. By off the grid, you mean as far away from me and Maddox as they can get. Tristan didn't dignify my comment with a response, not that he needed to. I could tell I had hit the nail on the head. Unfortunately, his frown lines were going to worsen, because I had no choice but to bring up Holly. There's something else. We need to talk to Holly about her nightmares. I told him firmly, instantly seeing the disapproval in his eyes. I shut him down with a hard look and continued, she's been seeing things in those nightmares, and there's a chance it could have something to do with tonight's AK. We have to try, Tristan. I hated the pleading edge in my voice, and even more so the way his eyes narrowed, and his posture became tense. It took him a few long seconds to reply, I can't promise she'll open up. She's been closed off lately, even to me. She won't admit it, but this witch is her last chance. Get her to come downstairs, and I'll talk to her. I told him, knowing from experience the only one she allowed inside her bedroom was Tristan, and that was only for minutes at a time. Shortly after our father's DH, I had convinced Holly to talk to a therapist. This was before she had closed herself off to the world, barely venturing out at night even though she could walk during the day with little discomfort. Therapy was slowly helping, revealing the fears she had about the outside world. The start of her nightmares, it had sent her reeling backwards. It's been over a week since I've seen her face, and even longer since she's seen sunlight. Tristan vanished upstairs, his faint knock on her door the only sound I could hear. We waited for the better half of an hour, our breath held as he finally emerged and came downstairs. The crease between his eyebrows had vanished, but his eyes remained troubled. She's coming downstairs. Lola, if you push too hard, I have no clue how she'll react. I took Tristan's warning as truth, because at the moment, no one knew her better. I could hear the soft tap of her feet first, a steady rhythm as she rounded the corner and followed in Tristan's footsteps. As I saw her face, I was reminded of all the features I had gotten from our father. The raven hair and pale eyes, our full lips rounded ever so slightly at the top, they all belonged to him. Holly had lost weight since I had last seen her. The roundness in her face had vanished, revealing her high cheekbones and sharp jawline. Her skin had paled, making her hair and eyes look even more startling. I could see the hesitation in the way her eyes flitted from face to face, and her fingers toyed with the hem of her t-shirt. It's good to see you, Holly. I kept my voice neutral, hating the soft and delicate tone people would use when they viewed you as wounded. I hoped she would notice the difference, and see that no one here saw her as weak. There was no easing into this, not when Holly's nightmares sent her spiraling into fits of terror or rage. Those long nights were just as horrifying, and there had been nothing to prepare her then. A college student was MD last night, and I need to know if you've seen anything about her DH, or the people who caused it. Chapter 118. I had never been good at sugar-coating things, but I tried to tone down the details as I told her what I knew. There was a nervous flutter in my chest because she hadn't turned and bolted up the stairs. She was still here, listening even though her eyes were somewhere far away. Her name was Carson, she went to the university in town and ran one of the sororities. She had friends and a family. I explained, I know it's a long shot, but I had to ask. I know you weren't aware of our father's plans, but this was how it started before. She's the first, but there's too high a chance she won't be the last. Holly was silent for so long that I wondered if coming here was useless. She was unnaturally still. Tristan was the only one who wasn't on edge, leaning against the wall as if this was common occurrence. I don't always see things, sometimes it's sounds or feelings. Her voice was soft and a few octaves higher than mine. I met her gaze unflinchingly. Anything that could tie into last night? There was a party at a lake in the middle of the forest, then another at a frat house in town. She paused, and something in my chest jumped as I registered the thoughtful look on her face. Part of me was giddy. This was the most we had spoken in weeks. I haven't slept much these last few days, she admitted quietly, not looking Tristan's way. No matter what she gave me, I knew I wouldn't be disappointed. I could smell something sweet, but it was a different kind of sweet than what vampires smell like. I also heard a girl laughing, but it wasn't nice laughing. Red hair, but now I think that's because it was covered in blood. That's all I remember. I believed her, reading the guilt in her eyes. My nightmares were few and far between compared to hers, but they also made little sense. I knew how disorienting they could be and wanted to give her the same shred of hope that I carried. Rowena, the witch that got here yesterday, she said that training will help you. It'll give your magic an outlet, so it doesn't have to show itself in other ways. You'll be able to get some sleep for a change. I told her, relief building in my chest as the smallest of smiles crossed her face. While Tristan and Giovanni got in touch with their contacts, Maddox and I went back to the crime scene. After a quick phone call to Cordelia and Rowena, the two were on their way to meet us. There were only a handful of warriors left combing through the lake and surrounding beach, the rest having taken up patrol duties for the rest of the day. Maddox spread the word to expand the perimeters another 5 miles. Far enough to search the land without straying too far from home. The crowd of college students had been chased away, giving us the privacy to speak freely. We'll start on the beach and make our way to where the body was found, Maddox said, his hand on the small of my back as I led the way. I wasn't sure how I knew where I was going, but my feet carried us down the beach, to where I had run into Devon. Just a few feet away was where Zeke and Carson were, where we had taken that picture. That poor girl. I can only imagine how her family feels. Rowena's voice was solemn, her eyes downcast as they scanned the forest. Cordelia's sad smile held the same flicker of wisdom as Grandma's. If there's anything here to pick up, we'll find it. I'll light a candle for Carson tonight, and for her family. We reached the edge of the forest and continued through, sticking to one of the smaller trails I had taken in my search for Maddox. It was silent apart from Cordelia's soft humming and the occasional snap of a branch. Neither said a word until we reached the small clearing where Carson's body had been discovered. She was found against that tree. I nodded ahead, eyes darting down to the large spot of dried blood. The grass had gone from emerald, to crimson, to brown. Was there a time of DH? Cordelia asked. 1 to 3 in the morning. Zeke said Carson got in the Uber a little past midnight. It's a half-hour drive to the lake from there. Maddox responded. Both witches explored the clearing. Rowena with her auburn hair and slacks, and Cordelia, hair streaked with grey and clutching the pendants around her neck. Several minutes passed and Rowena was the first to speak. This is not helpful or comforting, but I sense it was a violent DH. You don't feel that? Cordelia frowned, growing still. So faint, I almost missed it. She stood in front of the tree Carson had been sitting against. Dried blood turned the roots black, making the tree look infected. Her fingers grazed the bark ever so gently. What are you feeling? Rowena asked curiously, her mossy eyes locked on the older witch. All I'm getting is fear and confusion. Is it magic? I couldn't help but ask, hoping desperately for some clue that would point us in the right direction. I'd assume it were magic, but it's so faint. I'm afraid I can't get an accurate read on it. All magic leaves a trace, doesn't matter what kind it is. There's spells to cover your tracks, but if you know what you're looking for, they can be unraveled. She explained, looking down at the dried patch of blood. Her eyes were more than troubled when she spoke. Whatever this is, it wasn't a spell meant to cover tracks. It's like what happened here has been seared from the land, and what I'm sensing is just the scar. So that's it then. Whether or not it's the vampires orchestrating this, there are witches involved. I swallowed, feeling the looming sensation that I was way in over my head. Cordelia stepped away from the tree and murmured something softly. I think it's safe to say that, yes. There's a witch, or witches after you, Luna. We couldn't have come at a better time, could we? Rowena locked eyes with the other witch. Both had identical looks of worry. Trying to sleep that night was more difficult than ever. I had finally succumbed to my exhaustion around 3 in the morning, smothered in Maddox's arms and masculine scent. I could tell by the way my eyes ached that I hadn't slept for long. Spending a solid 15 minutes brushing the knots from my dark hair, I stuck my head out of the bathroom when I heard the doorbell's silvery chime. I'll get it. I called out to Maddox, who was still in the shower. I was surprised to see a head of golden hair through the front door's square pane of glass. The lock clicked as I opened the door, seeing Cassidy's smiling face. Part of me was a bit surprised, there was no way word hadn't spread by now. Hey, Lola. Sorry to stop by all randomly, I was on my way to the gym and your new house happens to be in the same direction. Her high pony and sports bra legging combo backed up her words. Her smile fell just a sliver. Oh, you aren't busy, are you? Not at all, come in. I opened the door for her. Actually, I did stop by for a reason, she began, but was distracted by the house. Her pale lips popped open, and a sound of enjoyment escaped them. Oh, this place is beautiful. The marble fireplace, the countertops and appliances. Oh, he outdid himself. You knew Maddox was having the house built? I asked curiously, watching her roam the kitchen and living room, making small remarks of approval as she went. Of course, I did. She giggled softly. Back before Maddox became all broody, when he was still a chubby-faced kid, he always said he'd build his maid a castle. With how things are going, we could use the protection of a castle. I joked, even though a frown twitched at the corners of my lips. Oh, that reminds me. I almost forgot why I stopped by. Cassidy shook her head and fished her cell phone out of her purse. I watched in silence as she tapped at the screen, her nails clicking against the glass. Guilt curled in my stomach when she pulled up the sorority's IA page. The most recent photo posted was one at the party last night. There's been a lot of comments on this picture, most of which aren't good. I've been doing some damage control, but her posting this then DG hours later. Devin and his idiotic friends have been stoking the flames, but I'll make sure they get theirs. I was stunned and flattered that Cassidy wanted to help, that she believed this random girl who was mated to her close friend. Sure, the pack had no choice but to respect me as their Luna, but they still had a mind and opinions of their own. As much as I wanted to thank Cassidy for all of her help, my eyes were locked onto something much more important. You said Cassidy posted this picture? I asked. Cassidy gave me an odd look but shrugged. Yeah, she's the one with the login info. Why? This picture was posted at 4 in the morning. I explained, realizing things had just made themselves that much more complicated. The time of DH was between 1 and 3. There's no way she's the one who posted this. Chapter 119. You're sure? I asked Mason, my irritation increasing with each missing piece thrust in front of my face. Mason met Maddox and I on our way to Carson's parents' house. My stomach was rumbling from the lack of food, but I wasn't sure I'd be able to keep anything down if I tried. Just the thought of facing the shattered remains of her family, it left my nerves frayed and exposed. He nodded, just as perplexed. Positive. Not only was Carson the only one with access to the sorority's social media account, but the picture was also posted from her phone. Thanks, Mason. I sighed, feeling that familiar pang of guilt as I looked into his mossy hazel eyes. Maddox's phone began to ring. He frowned at the screen and turned away, placing the phone against his ear. The voice on the other end was muffled, but it was Mason I had my attention on. Don't feel bad, Lola. We've both been busy these last 2 weeks. His easygoing smile gave me some reassurance, but not much. Once you start your training back up, we'll see more of each other. How has training been going? I asked, feeling a little more light-hearted when some of the spark returned to his eyes. It's harsher here in the capital. Your mate was going easy on us back then, you know. He grinned, and it was impossible not to smile back. Even with my stomach full of dread, Maya and I were both excited to keep up with our warrior training. He got into the Chevy Maddox loaned him and chuckled, "Give me a call when you're ready to join. There's still some empty slots left, not that it matters since you're Luna and all." Facing Carson's parents, it was a sign of respect and something we were expected to do as Luna and Alpha. It was the circumstance and cause of DH that soured things, which made my heart hammer mercilessly as we climbed the cement steps of Carson's family home. I wouldn't run, even if the cowardly voice in my head begged me to do so. I could feel pieces of myself, of the carefully constructed facade I had erected, cracking and chipping away as I saw the hole that had been torn through her family, and through their lives. Her parents were respectful and gracious to Maddox and me, who had a hand in their daughter's DH, no matter how removed that hand might be. The grief in their eyes and hearts radiated from every pore, filling the house until the air was thick and heavy. Sounds were deeper, scents richer. I couldn't smile this time, knowing how flimsy and fake it would look. These people, who held pieces of their daughter within their chestnut hair, pale eyes, full lips, and dimpled cheeks, they would see right through it. Parents cursed with losing a child, they knew what fake smiles looked like. The photos that lined the walls, framed in thick wood and covered in streak-free glass. Smiles and bright eyes, young baby-like faces that slimmed and lengthened with age. Missing teeth became full, toddler bob cuts grew into long curls. They were whispers and echoes of the past carried throughout the future. I stared at the last family photograph on the wall until my eyes grew painfully dry. These walls showed the lives of Carson and her younger sister, showed them grow and mature over the years. Carson, in her high school graduation gown, and her sister, wearing a dress of pink tulle. There would be no college graduation, no mate or grandchildren appearing in the family photos, tracking the milestones of their lives. I wanted to apologize for their loss, but I knew once the words escaped, they'd bounce from picture to picture until they too faded. Instead, I channeled the kindling of rage that had ignited the moment I saw her body. I let it smooth out the cracks and bumps of emotion in my voice until I sounded as harsh and unforgiving as a Luna should. Instead of promising vengeance, I promised closure. I swallowed the emotion from my voice and sucked in another greedy gulp of fresh air. Why would the KR post that photo of Carson and I? I asked Maddox on our drive to the house the witches were staying at. He said nothing about how I'd been fighting tears for the last 15 minutes, and instead gave me time to sort through the hurricane in my head. The steady rhythm of his hand along my TH soothed the rain and harsh whines into something gentler. He was reluctant to leave me there alone, especially since there was no solid way to vet Rowena or Cordelia. All we had to go on was my elusive gut feelings and Holly's nightmares that she rarely talked about. Maddox's suspicion made him unnaturally careful. It's part of what makes him an incredible alpha, but allowing two witches onto his land, within close proximity of his mate, there was so much out of his control. To create chaos. Maddox grunted, his thick fingers wrapped tightly around the steering wheel. Just the sight of him, tense and rough in all the right places, it took away some of the anxiety that made my throat ache. People like Carson's parents, they respect our family. No matter what they're going through, they trust us to have their best interests in mind. We take care of our own, but that doesn't mean everyone's on board. We have to contain this, before anyone else is KD. I accepted every bit of strength Maddox could give me, and let it chase away the chill of the shadows that were never far from reach, reminding me there was always another way. We pulled into the curved driveway, stopping a few feet short of the two-car garage. I noticed a head of glossy auburn hair, like rubies in the sunlight, from up on the porch. Anything happens, you call, or mind link. Maddox's stern voice made my stomach flutter and brought a smile twitching at the corners of my lips. I held it back as best I could and leaned towards him. He made no movements as I brushed my lips against his, once and then twice, savoring the clash of sparks that tickled my skin. I thought you alphas were used to taking risks. I peered into his toffee-colored eyes, mesmerized by the shimmer of gold in their depths. You're worth too much to risk. His voice was sincere but held a hint of darkness made it grow deep. That possessive glint in his eyes, for a moment I swore he contemplated locking the doors and speeding away, giving in to those instincts that told him to protect at all costs. He knew I'd fight, though. That there was no way he could control me, and even though it infuriated him, it was what kept us clawing at one another. Your mate struggles to control his instincts, Rowena said in a voice void of judgment. I could smell the lavender wafting from the cup of tea in her hands and noticed a few small buds floating on the surface. She looked up at me from where she sat on the porch, reclined on the plush cushion of a wicker bench. It's what sets him apart, what makes him a ferocious alpha, but it is also weakness. Weakness? How is it weakness? His need to claim and protect. Too much can interfere with fate, and fate, she rarely likes to be meddled with. Rowena shook her head, chasing the momentary fog from her emerald eyes. She stood and smoothed out the form-fitting dress she wore, which was cinched at the waist with a thin belt and ended just above her knees. With the sleek heels and updo, she looked nothing like the preschool teacher I had imagined. I followed her through the front door, catching a strong whiff of dried herbs and petals. Nearly a dozen bundles sat on the kitchen table, bound in frayed twine. It gave the house a sweet scent with an earthy undertone. Rowena passed the living room and kitchen, venturing down a short hallway to where the den was. Bookshelves lined the walls, circling an oak desk stacked with old-looking texts. The window seat with its dainty throw pillows and the armchair with its clawed feet were the only comforting things in the room. He knows he can't protect me from everything, I assured her. Trusting Maddox was second nature, and while he'd do everything possible to keep me alive, only together could we protect the pack. I'm sure he does. The worry faded from her eyes, and her nude painted lips tilted up in a relieved smile. I apologize, the young girl's DH has me a bit shaken up. It's taken some time for the severity of the situation to sink in. I understand this isn't what you signed up for. Training two young witches is exactly what I signed up for, regardless of everything else going on. Rowena waved a hand dismissively, turning away just as the door swung shut. There was nothing connecting her motion to the door closing, and yet I knew it was magic she had used. I could feel its gentle charge in the air, almost untraceable as it fizzled out ever so quickly. In time, doing trivial things like that will become second nature. She explained, directing me towards the armchair. For now, let's see what I can learn about your magic. Her hands were cold and steady as they sought out my own, which is naturally have a better intuition than most, but our skill still varies. Most of us get feelings through touch, but the rare few can pick up bits of information. Can you do that? I asked, forcing the unease far from my eyes, shoving it down where it couldn't be seen. Really, it's not as ominous as I'm making it out to be. Her laughter was light, making her shoulders gently shake. Every witch's energy is different. By holding your hands, I'm able to seek out that energy with my own. First lesson, this particular trick is a form of passive magic. It happens on its own without my control or say. Active magic requires concentration and intent. Like what you did with the door. I commented, glancing across the room. Exactly. She nodded, sounding just as a proud teacher would. Her manicured nails rested along my hands. This might take a few seconds, maybe even a minute or two. I've never tried to get a read on a Luna or Vampire Queen. I watched and waited as Rowena closed her eyes. The golden light trickling through the parted CS made the highlighter across her cheekbones and eyelids sparkle. I had to admit, I was expecting a zap or tingle. Something like the foreign rush that was actual magic. It reminded me of shifting, letting this wild energy burst free. There was nothing, not the faintest whisper of magic nor the slightest movement beyond the protective boundaries of my mind. As Rowena's confident smile lessened, morphing into a confused frown, I felt my expectations fall. Well, that's certainly odd. There's something different about your magic, which I'd assume was obvious since you're the first tribrid in existence. She sighed, though not in defeat. I have a few witch friends. I can make a few calls, see what they can find out through the grapevine. If there's anything you know about your heritage, even if it seems useless or obscure, please make me aware. Even the smallest bit of information can be useful. The name Rinaldi danced on my tongue when the weight of a freight train forced the air from my lungs. The gut feeling was more like a punch in the face, but its message was well received. For whatever reason, my witchy intuition was telling me to keep my mouth shut. Chapter 120. Of course, I'll let you know. The lie felt wrong on my lips, but the fleeting sense of guilt had nothing on the feeling rolling through me right now. Like a landslide, boulders tumbled and collided in the pits of my stomach. I had never been exceptionally skilled at lying, so I added on a few details to make it more believable. Brianna's parents are scholars. They're working with a few of, I paused and the phrase vampire henchmen came to mind, my men to search through my father's family tree. By your men I assume you mean the vampires currently on your side. She shifted in the armchair, crossing one leg over another. Her sculpted lips tilted up in a knowing smile. I don't fear vampires, Lola. Our ancestors had no reason to fear other species, not when their numbers rivaled the vampires' kingdom, and the werewolves' packs. It's a mindset I try to keep alive, even though things are drastically different now. How were things back then? I've only ever read about werewolves and vampires, I've never read anything about witches in our history. Trust me, they're in there. Names and details were changed, but I bet you there's a handful of witches in your history books. She said matter-of-factly, her whimsical voice taking on the tone of a schoolteacher. As she glanced down at her forgotten teacup, her mouth popped open. Oh, how rude of me not to offer. Would you like any tea? I actually ran into your grandmother today, managed to take a bushel of lavender off her hands. Grandma gave you a bushel? She must really like you. She wouldn't even let me pull up the weeds from her garden. I chuckled, but politely declined. Given, I wasn't the most gentle. I'd always be Grandma's #1 fan with her lavender cookies and loaf cake, but hot tea just wasn't something I could get behind. I opted for a bottle of water and tried not to stare open-mouthed at all the jars, plants, and questionable containers in the refrigerator, most of which couldn't possibly be food. I'd have never known you were related if she hadn't mentioned how much her granddaughter loved her lavender cookies, and that she had even gotten the alpha himself hooked on them. She's earned her bragging rights with those cookies, she mentioned. I snickered, but found myself stopping short, thinking back to what Rowena had told me. I sank into the armchair, taking another long drink of water to swallow the lie I had told. How did you learn about our kind's history? When I needed to learn about vampires, I started in the past. This time, I feel like I'm stumbling around blind. There's much history even I don't know. I'm sorry to say that everything I've learned has been passed through my family, or through witches I no longer have contact with. As a child, we lived next door to another house of witches. Their daughter was my age, and we'd often teach one another what we learned. A hint of nostalgia mixed with the sympathy in her mossy eyes, dimming the color into a light sea green. I made the mistake of teaching her about blood magic. I knew no actual spells, but the topic is taboo in our world, especially back then. I never saw her again after that, but I still think about her from time to time. That's horrible. It wasn't your fault. I frowned. No, it wasn't. Still, her mother did what she thought right at the time. Rowena shrugged her narrow shoulders, then leaned forwards to top off her tea. A dash of cream and 2 sugar cubes later, the light scent of lavender filled the air. She grew quiet for a few seconds when a flash of determination crossed her eyes. With your permission, I'd like to get a read on you again. That girl I told you about, she was 3 years older than me, and much more skilled than I. When I was 7, she used her magic to coax mine out. I glanced down at her hands, feeling that flicker of excitement at the thought of using actual magic. The harsh gut feeling that had prompted me to keep my mouth shut was gone, by the white noise in my mind. I couldn't help but think of Rowena and the girl next door, 2 young witches. They had both been born into this, trained as soon as they could walk and talk. There was a chance that the witch or witches involved in Carson's DH had the same lifelong training, and that alone solidified my decision. This time around you'll feel my magic. What I'm doing is no longer passive, not when I'm actively using my energy to get a rise out of yours. She said, eyes sparkling as she took a few slow breaths. Her slender face held an almost excited expression. I'll be honest, I've never done this before. Perhaps it's the preschool teacher talking, but I've always wanted to train a young witch. I'm far too skilled to unintentionally harm you, so you needn't worry there. I jumped when her hands met mine, though not because they were cold. This time around they were incredibly warm. They formed a vice grip around my own, not tight enough to harm, but enough to where I couldn't yank them away without a struggle. Even as she leaned over me, emerald flame flickering in those eyes of hers, I felt no warning or hesitation. I watched with wide eyes because I could see her magic as it radiated from her hands, like thin vines that made my skin tingle as they grew. It felt playful and curious as it curled around my fingers and hands, inching its way up my wrists. The vines that now reached my forearms slowed, becoming so still that I wondered if they had stopped altogether. I made no moves, still locked in place by Rowena's ironclad grasp on my hands. Her eyebrows scrunched together, her calm and mature voice was laced with confusion. Lola, are you doing this? I'm not doing anything. I'm going to add a little more force, alright? It won't hurt you. If anything, it'll just evoke a bigger reaction. Her smile was reassuring. She was the trainer, the one with the experience. Something clicked in my head as I registered the confidence in Rowena's voice. There had been something so comfortingly familiar about her, even though I was positive I'd never met her before. My mom had that same kind of can-do confidence, which I had found infuriating during my teenage years. No matter how big the problem was, she always had a solution. Do it. I could tell she gave it some juice, because the flame that made her emerald eyes flicker and glow grew brighter. The vines that were wrapped around my fingers and wrists thickened and pulsed, shooting up my arms at an incredible speed. Many things happened at once, all faster than I could process at the time. Looking back, I could feel the nanosecond where everything changed. Like a bottle of soda shaken past its breaking point, something exploded from beneath my skin. Rowena cried out the same moment the vines encompassing my arms were blown to pieces. She snatched her hands away from my own, but I had barely noticed as a loud explosion pierced my ears. The television across the room exploded, sending shards of glass scattering in all directions. Every light bulb in the room and possibly the house erupted with a loud pop, sending Rowena and I into darkness. Well, the circuit board is completely fried, Rowena said as she came up from the basement. She let out a shaky laugh and tucked in the strands that fell from her elaborate updo. I say this with the full confidence of the electrician I just spoke with on the phone. Silver lining, though. Witches always have too many candles. We'll put you and Cordelia in another house, but I need to know what was that? I felt your magic, and what just came out of me wasn't even remotely the same thing. It was like I frowned, fumbling for the right words. A wild animal? Something a part of you, but out of your control. Gone was the bedside manner of a preschool teacher, replaced with the confidence and authority of a witch. Knowledge simmered in her eyes, reminding me that there was much more to this woman than what was in her file. An entire life to accumulate knowledge and experience that I could only dream of. Yes, that's what it felt like. It's not another wolf spirit, I'll tell you that. You only get one. No refunds or exchanges. Maya grunted, and I would have rolled my eyes if I weren't already hanging on by a thread. Someone I don't know who, put a serious binding spell on your magic. My stomach dropped as irritation replaced the excitement and hope I had been desperately trying to hold onto. I added another bullet point to my list, another problem to solve. If I hadn't have let go of you, it would have KD me. A binding spell? What does that mean? It means any magic you try to do, if it even works, will be catastrophic. She frowned, standing from her seat to hurry towards a trunk set against the wall. I could make out small boxes and jars, little bottles with powders and liquids inside. Rowena's shoulders stiffened. Call your mate matter of fact, call the other witch too. We're going to need all the help we can get. Binding spells leave a mark of sorts. That mark is the key to undoing it. With how long it's been on you, it won't be easy to find. Chapter 121. When you called me saying you needed my help with magic stuff, this wasn't what I had in mind. Brianna frowned, her eyebrows gnashed together. She had a gentler version of Maddox's expression, who stood a few feet to her left, so still he looked carved from stone. Her eyes flitted down to the dark bra and underwear combo I wore, the one Maddox had picked out just a few weeks ago. I really need to start training again. I never realized how many calories shifting burned. I hear you and Giovanni train pretty hard already. I replied smoothly, my lips twitching as I resisted the urge to laugh. She flicked her chestnut hair over her shoulder and scoffed, Tristan's and AE. Rowena flitted into the room, a blur of auburn hair and pale skin. Like a hummingbird, she was light on her feet. She rummaged through trunks, glass bottles clinking and papers scratching against one another as she pulled out everything she was looking for. Cordelia's soft humming trickled in from the living room. Before slipping into the den to remove my clothes, I had watched amazed as she waved a hand and sent all the glass shards littering the floor and furniture tumbling towards one neat spot. "We're ready for you now." Rowena paused for a moment, her arms full of thick pillar candles and couple small journal-type books. She sounded a bit breathless, but only paused for a moment before flitting out of the den. Brianna glanced between Maddox and me. Perhaps she recognized the look on his face from spending so much time with Giovanni. "I'm going to wait for you guys out there. You don't have to do this." Maddox's voice held no blame, only understanding and the frustration that whatever this was, it wasn't going to be pleasant for me. "No one will blame you." They both knew why I called them here. I had told them everything Rowena told me, including the part where they would have to hold me down. "I know, but I have no choice. I can feel the power locked inside of me more and more. I have no clue what it is or what to do with it, but I want to learn. I need to learn," I told him, leaning into his touch because I knew that no matter how much he worried for me, he wouldn't stop me from doing this. This was a side of myself I needed to learn about. One just as powerful as the other two, if not more. I owed it to the people I vowed to protect, both vampire and werewolf. Sometimes I wondered how Maddox did it, if the weight placed on his shoulders no longer felt heavy because of how long he had carried it. I could feel the rapid thud of his heart against my hand and leaned into the kiss he placed against my forehead. His rough voice washed over me, "Don't spread yourself too thin, Lola. There's nothing wrong with doing some things for yourself." Cordelia and Rowena had outdone themselves. In just 15 minutes they cleared the living room of all debris and brought a small twin mattress down from one of the bedrooms. It sat in the middle of the room, surrounded by 2 rings of pillared candles. Blackout CS were drawn across the windows, so that the small flames were our only light source. As I looked closer at the pillared candles, I noticed symbols carved into the white wax. "All right, I've done my part. This room is as protected as it can be with such short notice," came Cordelia's voice from across the room. Her graying hair was woven into a thick braid that hung over her shoulder, and her eyes were sympathetic as they looked my way. She held a tiny amber bottle in her hands and pressed her thumb against the opening until a little droplet stuck to her finger. Rowena stood at her side, a white candle and a small leather-bound book in her hands. "I'm reworking a reveal spell from my family's grimoire. I hated it as a child, swore I'd never use it. It's meant to uncover secrets, but with a few tweaks it should uncover the mark from the binding spell." Surprise flashed across Cordelia's face, but she recovered a split second later. "The juniper oil is to protect and purify, and the frankincense to cleanse and reveal. I've anointed this candle with the same oils, as it's what will tie you to the spell," Rowena explained as Cordelia stepped forwards. I could smell the oils on her finger as she brought it to my forehead and traced a pattern along my skin. "I've set protection wards around this room. No one will be able to enter or leave while she's preforming the spell," Cordelia said softly, stepping back to admire her handiwork. My heart was hammering in my chest as I laid down on the spring mattress. Maddox hovered over my head, his calloused hands pinned my wrists down with ease. Brianna knelt by my feet, her eyes determined as she held them in place. She might not be able to shift, but she still had some serious strength. I won't lie, this spell isn't a pleasant one and I doubt this altered version will be any better. Revealing anything against its will is painful business. A dull fire glowed in Rowena's mossy eyes as she knelt between Maddox and Brianna, to my left. Cordelia took her place to the right, a spectator to what I knew was going to be a miserable experience. Your wolf will not like me after this, so do try to keep her from KG me. Now, hold her down and let's hope we don't have to flip her over. I would have laughed if it weren't for the serious look on her face. A thin sheen of sweat had already begun to coat my skin. As much as I tried to keep my attention on Maddox, I couldn't help but watch as Rowena took the white candle in her hands and lit it with another. Clutching it between both hands, she closed her eyes and began to speak softly. Seconds passed, and I watched the firelight dance over her hair, revealing the various tones of red. When she opened her eyes, the light within them had grown brighter. To reveal what's hidden within, let the wax pull the mark from beneath her skin. She said and placed the candle just a foot above my stomach, tilting it so that the melted wax veered towards my skin. What kid hadn't stuck their finger in the melted wax of a lit candle? That split second where the warmth was almost painful, until the wax hardened from the lack of flame, forming a little cap on the tip of your finger. My mom had yelled at me a time or two for doing just that. That was the pain I'd been expecting as I watched the melted wax pool beneath the flame. In one fluid motion, she left a trail of wax from one side of my hip to the other. Instead of a fleeting BN, it felt like a red-hot dagger had pierced my skin and set fire to what organs it slashed through. Oh, I gasped, lifting myself off the bed with enough force to make Maddox snarl. That's painful. Tell him to let us go. Maya's snarl made my head buzz. After what could have easily been several minutes, the searing pain flickered and faded, like a starved flame without anything to devour. Rowena repeated that same line a second time, and in one fluid motion, left a trail of wax down my left leg. The same searing pain commenced, and my body thrashed on its own, the adrenaline coursing through it demanded it fight. Don't let go. I snarled, gritting my teeth, and clenching my eyes to keep myself from kicking out with my foot and sending Brianna flying across the room. She continued with my right leg, and it took every ounce of remaining energy I had to hold myself back. My mind was working on overdrive, fixating on Brianna's left hand. She had broken that wrist when she was 12, before I had ditched her for Tyler's fake friends. All I'd have to do was get out of her grasp and kick that wrist hard enough. Rowena continued chanting that same rhyme beneath her breath, holding the candle until enough wax pooled to splash across my skin. As its stinging heat was poured down my left shoulder, dripping down my collarbones and into the lacy fabric of my bra, I let out a scream that was more rage than pain. With each new pour the pain of an old one would fade. I could feel the hardened bits of wax on my skin, could hear them tumbling onto the mattress as I thrashed and bucked. Once my limbs and shoulders were covered, the pain was nothing more than a dull sting. This one is going to hurt, I swore I heard Cordelia say softly, her voice full of sympathy that failed to reach my ears. Rowena poured the wax directly onto my chest, right where my heart was. Instantly I could feel something in my chest ignite. Where the fire had died out along my stomach and limbs, it flared to life in an explosion that made my back arch off the bed. Like layers of burnt skin being peeled away, I could feel something rising to the surface. I half expected the mark to smolder like embers, but not only was it ice cold against my skin, it wasn't even a mark at all. Cordelia was the first to speak. It's a sigil, one I've never seen before. Chapter 122. You're sure you're all right? Maddox asked for the second time. The only sign of his worry was the crease between his eyebrows and how his attention kept drifting from the road to where I sat in the passenger seat. Cordelia had taken a couple of photos of the sigil on my chest, the one now hidden by the oversized t-shirt I wore, to investigate herself. An X with frayed ends like fletching of an arrow, with a long slash that went vertically through the center. I tried not to worry too much that this one had left her stumped, and instead tried to stay optimistic. Brianna had sent the pictures to her parents, who would now be on the lookout for any texts or relics that matched. It doesn't hurt anymore, but it is strange, now that I can see this thing, it feels kind of familiar. I'm positive I don't have any memory of it though. I wished I could fully reassure him, but the strange feeling bubbling in my stomach had surfaced along with the sigil. I knew that the pain I had experienced wasn't the only reason Maddox was asking if I were all right. He'd always have a healthy dose of suspicion towards the witches, but he also trusted the gut feelings I had around them. The ones that told me both could be a threat if they wanted, but not to myself or anyone I held close. Alpha, Luna, Maddox's Beta's voice filled our heads without warning. Just got a phone call from a doctor up at Grove Hospital. There's a woman there who's just woken up from an 18-year coma. The picture of the symbol on that witch's hand, this woman has one that matches. Maddox and I locked eyes, undoubtedly thinking the same thing. Somehow, this woman is tied to the witch that had tried to kill me. So far, she was our only connection. Let's go. I told Maddox with a firm nod, I'll let my dad know we're stopping by afterwards. We had been just a few minutes away from Maddox's parents' house, where Dad, Grandma, and Sean were still staying. I was dreading having this conversation with him, because he already looked years younger since moving into town, but I had to ask about Mom. There was every chance that she had something to do with this binding spell, and even though I hoped she wasn't involved, I had long ago realized there was a lot I didn't know about the woman. The drive was a long 3 hours, but the views made the trip worthwhile. We were on a long highway that curved and winded through the mountains, past streams, and over a long bridge. Halfway through, the exhaustion from the ritual Rowena had done weighed my eyelids down. The gentle hum of the highway faded in my ears as darkness swallowed me whole. I woke startled, my heart thudding beneath the sigil on my chest. A dream I couldn't remember floated just out of reach, the details becoming hazier as more and more awareness seeped into my veins. Did we just get here? I mumbled to Maddox, who sat in the driver's seat tapping on the screen of his phone. As I sat up, I realized he had covered me up with his sweatshirt. Rather than giving it back to him, I slipped it on. Got here half an hour ago. He set his phone down and smirked, eyes trailing down my face to his sweatshirt. The remnants of his warmth still clung to the fabric. Not only was I drowning in the fabric, but also his masculine scent. You looked like you were getting good sleep for a change. The hall smelled of bitter antiseptic, with undertones of artificial fragrance within the soaps and cleaners used. Seeping through the veil was undertones of blood and pus, mixed with stale cafeteria food. I'd never been to a hospital myself, but I hadn't imagined it this busy. Werewolves weren't sick nearly as often as humans, so most of the wolves were here for some wound or another. There were a few humans in the mix, being treated first since their healing was much slower than ours. Oh! The young receptionist's cherry-colored lips popped open. The middle-aged RN in baby pink scrubs, who looked like she spent more time here than at home, was unfazed and even snorted at the receptionist as she tittered, "Alpha, what an honor. Dr. Anderson told me you two were coming." The RN gave the receptionist a side-eyed look and shook her head disparagingly, motioning for us to follow her down a wide hall. "Nice to meet you, Alpha, and Luna. Saw that speech of yours live. You didn't disappoint. Good to know I didn't scare everyone off." I replied with an awkward chuckle, it was a risky plan. Risky, but us werewolves don't scare easy. She nodded in agreement, her strong chin held high. My grandson was there in the crowd, saw the whole thing. Wouldn't stop talking about it for days, mind you. I reckon it was hard on you, Alpha. Seeing your mate get shot like that. I contemplated hiding in the crowd myself. Maddox's smile was polite, but Maddox's smile was polite, but anyone could see the truth in his eyes. Now that would have been a sight to see. She replied with a small chuckle. We turned down 3 separate hallways, each one bustling with nurses and patients. The RN stopped at one of the many doors and placed her badge against a small scanner. Might have taken a day off for a change to see that. Anyhow, the doctor's right inside. It was a pleasure meeting you both. You as well. I replied with a smile, following Maddox into the hospital room. 2 beds sat across from one another, separated by a seafoam-colored curtain. Both were surrounded by heart monitors and those wire hangers that hold bags of fluid. While one of the beds was empty, another held a woman just a few years younger than my dad. Her wheat blonde hair was short, curling at the ends where the strands reached her shoulders. The heart monitor at her side beeped slowly, because the woman on the bed was fast asleep. Alpha Maddox, and you must be Luna Lola. Glad you two could make it on such short notice. If you wanted to speak with her, I'm afraid she's been out for a while now. Dr. Anderson stood beside the woman's bed, a clipboard in his hand as he scribbled some notes and flipped to the next page. We had to sedate her shortly after she woke up. She has no idea where she is, and the last thing she remembers was from 18 years ago. I glanced at the woman in the bed, at her pale skin and angular nose. I tried and failed to imagine what it would have been like for her to wake up in a body 18 years older than what you had. Dr. Anderson caught my eye as they fell to the mark on her hand, identical to that of the witch that tried to kill me. He nodded impassively, his eyes curious as they remained steady on my face. When we pointed out this mark to her, to ask if she knew anything about it sent her into psychosis. Also, she's a full-blood werewolf. Found that out when she grew claws and tried to carve the mark off herself. I could see the questions bubbling in his eyes. I've worked at quite a few hospitals, and I've never seen a case like Flora's. 18 years. No brain damage, nothing on her MRIs. Perfectly healthy, and yet she wouldn't wake up. The mark on her hand, something like that looks an awful lot like magic. Don't know much about the subject, but parents told me plenty of stories about forest witches as a kid. Is there a question in there somewhere, Dr. Anderson? I took a step forward as I spoke, mostly to keep Maddox from snapping at the man. A hard-headed alpha through and through, but that's exactly why he needs me by his side. He tilted his head and studied my face. Guess I'm just curious if there are any vengeful forest witches I need to worry about. Not at the moment, but if that changes, we'll mind link you. My smile was playful, but still held the authority of a Luna. I continued before he had the chance to ask another question. Have someone contact us when she wakes up again, and if there's a psychologist in the building, send them here as well. Provide all resources needed for her to sort through the changes she's going through. When she's ready, we'll speak with her. For the time being, does she have any relatives nearby? I'm afraid not. I wondered if all doctors had the same sense of reserved sympathy, and if it was the things they witnessed in a day that taught them to hold it together so well. A couple in this pack adopted her as a child when her mother died. Her adoptive parents died in a house fire just a couple weeks after Flora slipped into a coma. There are a few distant cousins of her adoptive family a few states away. Are you thinking we should give them a call? It's been 18 years and not one family member has been to visit. I smiled sweetly. We'll let her decide if she wants to contact any family members, but I would like the name of the adoption agency that handled her case. Chapter 123. You handled that well. Maddox chuckled, his laugh deep and rich like liquid amber. His breath was hot and curled in the air between us. The cold metal of the car chilled my back, easily seeping through Maddox's sweatshirt. His hand rested on the roof of the car and his eyes were devastatingly serious as he said, I was going to tell him to take his questions and FK off. I always took the chance to toy with my hot-headed mate, especially when he made it so incredibly easy. I gave him a petulant look and tried to push past him, you never did have any manners. My back hit the side of the car with a little more force this time. Rather than hurting me, it brought a twisted smile to my face. My head swam with his earthy scent as he leaned in close, always hovering over me. I could feel his fingers tangling in my hair where they hadn't been before. You're wrong, I have some manners. He lowered his head and breathed in my scent. The stubble on his cheek grazed my neck, sending goosebumps pebbling my skin. He noticed every reaction my body had to his and chuckled in my ear. If I didn't, this entire hospital would hear me FK you on the hood of the car, and don't bother lying, Lola. You wouldn't lift a finger to stop me. I got my revenge an hour into our drive home. The sun had vanished, darkening the sky as the moon's silvery light took hold. The glittering forest, sprawling with light and life, turned dark and mysterious at night. You could fully appreciate how dense it was when day turned to night and the slivers of shadow began gather and pulse. I had been ignoring them for a while now and hadn't even allowed myself to glance their way. They were always there, just out of sight, constantly reminding me what they could do. What they could offer. No matter how tempting tapping into that power was, the price was rarely ever worth it. The darkness paired with the curvy highway was lulling me back to sleep, but there was something I wanted even more than another long nap, something Maddox had knowingly put into my head. Letting the image form in my mind, I pictured the two of us parked in a secluded dirt lot. The freezing metal of the car hood on my back was nothing compared to the heat of Maddox filling me, or the warmth his hand provided as it wrapped around my throat, his thumb stroking my cheek as he told me how good I was, how well I took everything he gave. I sent the mental image down the mate bond, always underestimating his reaction. I grabbed onto what my dad called the O-handle as Maddox's head snapped to where I sat, sending the car veering into the other lane. The tones of bright honey had been sucked from his eyes within half a second. Blinking rapidly, he sent us back into the right lane. Thankfully, we were the only car on the road, which is what finally made me giggle. What, Lola? His snarl was angry, but he couldn't stop glancing my way. Toying with Maddox, letting him evoke these feelings and emotions, it was a distraction from everything else going on, one I needed if I were going to survive the upcoming weeks. I was determined to savor every uninterrupted moment alone with him. Even though he was now expecting the next few clips I sent his way, he clearly underestimated my creativity. His knuckles turned white on the steering wheel, and his hair was now a mess from the number of times he ran his fingers through it. I had always been a fan of Maddox in sweatpants, especially now that the material was stretched taut against his EN. The moment the scent of my arousal permeated the car, Maddox jerked us to the side of the road. A small stretch of gravel provided even more coverage, not that it mattered with how quickly he tore the clothes from my body and pressed me against the hood. The husky sounds he made as he cursed me for being so tempting, for constantly wanting a rise out of him, they'd forever be seared into my memory. I was riding a post-S*X high until we reached his parents' house and I remembered I was going to dredge up some unpleasant memories. Dad still loved her in a way, and remembering that the woman he knew had a life full of secrets only brought him pain. It was around 10 o'clock at night when we strolled into Maddox's parents' house. The scent of Grandma's lavender cookies was within every corner of the house, and even trickled outside as we walked through the front door. Standing by the large entertainment center in the living room was Killian, a glass of amber liquor in his hand. Dad sat back in the leather recliner attached to the sectional. His eyes flitted up from the football game on TV as he greeted us. "If you're looking for Sean, he's not here, took up a part-time patrol shift." "What's got you two smelling like that?" Dad grunted, scrunching his nose as he took a long drink of the beer in his hand. For a moment embarrassment flooded my cheeks, but the scent of what Maddox and I had done was long gone. What did cling to our clothes and skin was the sterile scent of the hospital. Definitely a hospital. Claire's soprano came from the kitchen, followed by a head of chocolate brown hair. She held one of Grandma's cookies in her hand, and judging from the jumbo size, I'd say Grandma in for a long night. Only been to one a handful of times. I'm definitely not fond of them. I never could stand the smell of those places. He shook his head, his mind most likely flitting back to his injury and the physical therapy appointments he absolutely loathed going to. Grandma flitted out of the kitchen a couple seconds later, her soft black hair twisted into a bun on her head. The plate clinked against the glass-top table, turning it smoky from the steam. Tiny buds of lavender dotted the tops of the cookies, coupling with the specks of vanilla bean to form a beautiful pattern. "Claire's asked me to bake a few things for the university's bake sale fundraiser." Grandma smiled proudly, her apron speckled with hints of brown sugar and flour. "Begged was more like it. My cooking skills are sub-par and haven't improved much over the years." Claire sighed and shook her head. Killian looked her way, his eyes glazing over for just a few seconds before the forlorn look was wiped from her face, replaced with an intimate smile. She cleared her throat, blushing as she continued without pause. "Still, I could get used to this if I'm not careful. Your grandma is going to have the whole town hooked on these things. I might have to buy her a shop in town." Dad chuckled, his chest rumbling from the gravely sound. "It's worse when you're raised on it. You hire someone else to run the place and give me free reins of the kitchen and you got yourself a deal." Grandma said with a nod, darting back into the kitchen when the oven timer sounded. Maddox gave me a single look that made my stomach drop, and for once, I wished I hadn't developed the ability to see past his expressionless facade. I knew he had sent Claire a quick mind link when she snatched up another cookie and stood from the couch. "I think we should go look into that cookie shop." Claire stepped into Killian's side, molding herself to the previous alpha's torso. "But the game?" Killian frowned as Claire led him down the hall, his eyebrows gnashing together in an expression nearly identical to Maddox's. A strange flutter wormed its way into my heart as I tried to picture Maddox and I like that 20 years older with children of our own, looking around at all the hard work we had done over the years, and how our family and people could relax and reap the rewards. It was the future he worked towards, one where all people, werewolf or vampire, could safely have families of their own. Dad's low chuckle startled me. "Now that you've gone and chased everyone off, what's it you wanted to talk to me about?" "I might not be as useful as I once was, but I still got some of your grandma's genes. Means it's a little harder to pull the wool over my eyes." I took half a second to calm my nerves before jumping right in. Subtlety wasn't my strong suit, and I had spent the better half of the day gnawing over scenario after scenario. Rather than pull up a picture of the sigil on my chest, I lowered my shirt to show where my heart rested within my ribcage. Inches below my collarbone sat the sigil, its dark ink just as bright as Maddox's cobalt mark on my skin. "This thing on my chest, it's a mark from a binding spell to bind my magic." Mom was the closest person to me who knew the full truth about everything. Binding my magic sounds like something she would do, trying to keep me safe while also making things more complicated, but I need to know for sure so we can find a way to remove it. I sighed, guilt swirling within the depths of my stomach when an echo of pain flashed across his eyes I once thought held my same shade of blue. Father and daughter in every sense except for blood. I need you to think back, as far back as you can. Did anything at all stand out as strange to you? Was there ever a time where you didn't know where she was or what she was doing? I hate bringing this up, but I wouldn't if I weren't sure she had something to do with it. Other than when she came home with you bundled in her arms, crying that she had made a mistake, there's only one other time I can remember. When you were 5, your mom and I were going through a rough patch. Sean was getting into his preteen years, and he was nearing his first shift, so his hormones were all over the place. Things were getting bad with him in school. A few kids, they could tell he wasn't going to have a she-wolf for a mate. For a long while, your mom and I argued on how to approach it. She wanted to storm the school with her claws drawn. I didn't want the kid to feel like it was something abnormal or strange, so I disagreed. Dad cleared his throat. Regret flashed in his eyes, mingling with the wisdom and experience he accumulated over the years. I thought we were close to divorce, so I told her I understood when she took you and went to Mom's cottage. I'm sorry, she said. What? Grandma's head popped out from the kitchen, and as though she could see it through the clothes I wore, her eyes latched onto the binding spell sigil. That woman never brought Lola to my house, certainly not by herself. Chapter 124. You're absolutely positive? I asked both Dad and Grandma, who were locked in a staring match that was now going on 2 minutes. She never brought Lola to your cottage. Dad's lips fell, and everything inside of me regretted bringing this up. From her leaving him years after having Sean, to returning with me in her arms and a shadow hovering over her shoulder. They had been through more than most mated couples, and somehow managed to make it work up until her DH. Uncovering her secrets felt like peeling back the layers of my memories until the woman who had raised me was almost unrecognizable. No, not once. Grandma replied. She and Mom had never gotten along, and it was Mom's refusal to let us see her that drove a wedge in between her and I. Dating Tyler only wedged that chasm open even more. How old was I when she took me? When she came back, did she act any different? Did I act any different? Your mom seemed happy, a lot more relaxed than when she left with you. We talked things out about Sean, and even asked him what he wanted us to do. It took him a minute to think. By the time he spoke, I was so lost in thought I had nearly missed the sound of his voice. It had faded into the background along with the rundown of tonight's football game told by the announcers. Also, I'd say you were about 9 or 10. I remember you were sleeping when she brought you home. Slept all night and all day too. She said you were tired from playing and staying up late, but I guess that wasn't the case. 9 or 10. If I was that old, how come I have no memory of it? I don't even remember her and I going on a trip like that. If she knew a witch that could preform a binding spell, isn't it possible they also altered your memory? Grandma suggested, her voice kind even though there was no gentle way to say it. Another problem that needed solving, only this solution required me uncovering memories that could have been scrubbed from my head by the same magic that put my powers in a chokehold. I'll talk to Rowena and Cordelia about it tomorrow. I'm still training with them, even though I can't actually use my magic. As Maddox drove the two of us home, I racked my memories for anything that seemed out of place. Even though I had come up short a dozen times, it kept me distracted from the pangs of guilt in my chest. I'm sure none of us were going to get a good night's sleep, least of all Dad. She found someone to bind my magic, and never once thought to tell me about any of this. I scoffed, does it make me a bad person to wish she was alive just so I could ask what she was thinking? The sound of frustration I made was muffled by Maddox's chest as he wound his arms around my waist and pulled me close. I was enveloped by him and silky blanket that covered us, lulled by his scent and the sparks of the mate bond. I should have been knocked out and drooling, but my mind refused to shut down. It was the first time I had admitted any of this aloud. I never usually had a tough time talking about my emotions, but my mom was a sore subject. I missed her desperately, but I was also so furious I could spit fire. What I needed was one of our old screaming matches, where I'd shout from down the hall, doing everything I could to grate on her nerves and goad her into fighting back. I'd give up and slam my bedroom door, knowing it was one of her pet peeves. There weren't only bad memories of my mom and me. Countless trips to the aquarium and zoo, where at the end of the day my cheeks would ache from laughing so much. Sleepovers where she'd drag out her makeup bag and show me all the little powders and brushes until we were both covered in splotches of color. You have every right to be angry with her. She's your mom and you love her, but she kept 2/3 of your heritage from you. Maddox wasn't one to talk about his emotions, so it always surprised me how insightful he could be. Listening to the steady thud of his heart against his ribcage, I opened myself up to what he was saying and felt some of that rage subside. To play devil's advocate, have you ever thought she might have planned on telling you at some point if she hadn't been KD? Ugh, tell me something that'll make me happy. I sighed into his chest and smiled softly when he shuddered from the feel of my nails skating down his abdomen. Maddox thought for half a second and replied, "It's been 24 hours since we've last seen my brother. Now that's a happy thought." Maddox dulled my anger until it no longer hurt to SW. Still, all I could think about as my exhaustion grew stronger and sleep hovered at the edges of my vision was another version of my life where Mom hadn't been KD in battle. Would it have changed anything? She barely called when I lived at Grandma's for that year. My head pulled me one direction, battering me with facts while my heart ran in the opposite direction, bringing up memory after memory until darkness swallowed me whole. I woke in the middle of the night to a tugging feeling in my chest. Like a second heartbeat knocking against my ribcage, it thudded relentlessly until I turned over in bed and groaned. The crisp air made my NS pebble and sent goosebumps racing along my skin. Half awake and longing to slip back into that peaceful deep sleep where dreams are nowhere in sight, I stumbled over to the middle window along the bedroom wall. All three were large with clear panes of glass that let in endless sunlight. Giant blackout CS were all that kept the sunlight from pouring through each morning. Using an arm to cover my BS, I inched open the curtain and peeked outside. The sky was painted in shades of dark blue and purple, hinting at the rising sun which would make its appearance in just a few short hours. I could see the outline of the forest that surrounded our estate, forming a half circle around the back. My eyes darted downward to the flat expanse of land below. A stone garden wall separated the yard from the forest, and standing just on the other side of the fence was Tristan. The expression on his face was blank, apart from his blonde eyebrow which he cocked a second after our gazes caught one another. I rolled my eyes and closed the curtain, nearly tripping over the bench at the end of the bed as I searched for the t-shirt and sweatpants I tossed to the floor earlier. "You've got to start embracing your vampire side." Tristan shook his head disapprovingly. "What kind of vampire queen goes to bed at 9 at night? One that's half werewolf and has a lot on her plate," I said dryly, briefly glancing at the writhing shadows along the forest line, making sure they kept their distance. "You might be fond of these late-night chats, but this is interrupting my beauty sleep. Did something urgent happen? As if you need it, and it's more early morning than late night." He replied, "Urgent? No, not yet. Giovanni left a few hours ago to meet up with his contacts, the ones that might have some texts on magic. Also, I heard about your magical block. I think it'd be helpful to know Holly doesn't have one. The only reason I hadn't asked the location of Giovanni's contacts was because of their wavering loyalty to my father. This particular vampire family was close to him, close enough to safeguard ancient magical texts my father had absolutely no use for. Storming their home would give me the information I needed, but not their loyalty. If I could somehow gain their allegiance, other well-known families would follow. Good, at least someone can train their magic. I sighed, unsure why I was telling Tristan this. We're thinking it was my mom who had a witch place the block on me when I was young. Is there any chance my father might have had something to do with that? No, he wouldn't have wanted your magic blocked. If anything, he would have. Tristan went still in that unnatural way that vampires did, speaking softly to himself though no sound was coming out. Was it about 10 years ago that your mother had this done? He asked, sky blue eyes bright as they stared at me through the night. 9 or 10, yet. I nodded. I was a child back then, but I remember something. Tristan said, something made your father incredibly angry. He called my father and uncle, along with Giovanni's father, and had them meet at his headquarters. I have no clue what they talked about, but my father and uncle left that day for a week-long mission when they failed. Only my father and Giovanni's returned. I knew little about Tristan's family, other than the fact that he had a younger sister who adored him. Not a single respected vampire family joined our side. As Tristan once explained very sourly, they were all pure-blooded and like the pedestal my father placed them on, high above the half-bloods. That was the first thing I did away with, the insane notion that a full-blooded vampire was better than a half-blood one. Werewolves weren't prejudiced with full and half-bloods, though we had plenty faults of our own. Tristan and Giovanni's only stipulation to working as my right-hand men was that Maddox or I wouldn't go after their families. We would give them time to speak with them, to slowly win them over as they realized that this new world was happening whether they liked it or not. You think he was trying to stop my mom from having the block put on me? Tristan's face was resolute. There is nothing redeemable about the man, but if there's one thing your father respected it was power, and there's no way he'd let anyone take yours. Chapter 125. It took another hour to fall back asleep. Standing out in the early morning chill, talking about ADD man whose presence still made me shudder, it had chased away the remnants of sleep that weighed my eyelids down. I stayed curled in Maddox's embrace, enjoying the warmth and his woodsy scent as sleep slowly reclaimed me. That morning I was out of bed bright and early, driving to a coffee shop just outside of town but still within the PAX borders. We had stopped there on our way in, and Brianna fell in love with their caramel macchiatos and bear claws. It had been a last-minute decision to drive the extra 15 minutes and grab us one since we'd both be spending the morning with Cordelia. Maddox and I had been working on my driving for the last few months, and I've improved drastically despite his hesitance on letting me go off alone. Coasting down the winding highway, seeing nothing but dense forest and a few cabins, was much less exhilarating than running on 4 legs. Driving the vehicle myself made it a little more bearable. The coffee shop outside of town was a little building along a strip of boutiques and shops. Vines with baby pink flowers wrapped around the doorway and hung over the large display window out front. A milk and cream bar wrapped around half of the counter and was dotted with various syrups and flavorings. Brianna and I had tried to make our own coffee the first time, but both of us lacked the magic touch the baristas here had. A giant chalkboard took up the wall behind the counter, and had the menu written in near-perfect handwriting. Little doodles of coffee beans and cappuccinos with fancy art took up the free spaces. I nodded and waved politely when people walked by, their eyes lighting up with recognition as they spotted my face. It was impossible to avoid people once I stepped into the quaint coffee shop. The golden bell at the top of the door was almost deafening to my ears as eyes lifted from their phones and conversations to look my way. I steered my gaze towards the only things that mattered, the pastries in the display case and the source of the rich coffee scent permeating the shop. Luna Lola, good to see you again. I didn't even recognize the sound of Lars's voice until I turned and spotted his dimpled grin and shaggy hair. He looked different than he had at the party, donning a leather jacket and faded jeans. Feeling even more stares on my face from how ungodly loud he was, I hushed him and frowned. Were you trying to keep your appearance here secret, because everyone was already staring at you before I said anything? His whisper was still loud enough for everyone in the shop to hear since most of the customers were werewolves. That was the goal. I replied and gave him a forced smile, remembering the mirth in Cassidy's voice as she talked about girlfriend. Great to see you, have a good one. Hey, what did I do? I might not have the best track record, but I think I'd remember pissing off the Luna. His smooth grin might have worked on me if I weren't already bonded to my other half, so I couldn't help but find it a bit lackluster. Like a half-dressed male model on a magazine, it was two-dimensional and bland. I haven't been in town long, but I already have friends here. One of those friends is Cassidy. You know, the girl you went out with the night of the party. I lifted an eyebrow at him, letting him see exactly how unimpressed I was. Now, it's not my business, but sleeping with another girl while you're dating someone, it's a bit pathetic. If I knew Cassidy would rat me out to the Luna, I would have chased after her. Lars shook his head, and if he hadn't have continued without pause, I probably would have decked him right here in line. It's ex-girlfriend, actually. Cassidy never gave me the chance to explain before she broke my nose and stormed off. Talk about an overreaction. She broke your nose. I held back my laughter with a snort. Lars's shoulders fell, and keyed my motorcycle. Wait. Why was your ex-girlfriend calling you anyway? I couldn't help but ask. He smirked through the pain, thought it wasn't your business? Kidding, kidding. My ex was calling me because she's incredibly annoying and needy. Oh, and she's mated to my younger brother. Hopefully he's nicer to her than you are. Either Lars was too dense to hear the disdain in my voice, or he just didn't care. With the last shreds of my patience floating in the wind, I was about to turn on my heel and promptly end our conversation when a thought came to mind. Cassidy actually mentioned something really interesting you said that night. What was it? Something about hot vampire, I believe. He flinched and gave me a sheepish grin that did nothing to lessen the severe look on my face. Yeah, that sounds like something drunk me would say. Next. The teenaged cashier shouted, his eyes widening when he spotted me. I walked up to the register but turned back to glance at Lars, who stood a few feet behind me, his hands in his pockets and a look of curiosity in his eyes. Perhaps you should keep drunk you in check. He certainly doesn't have what it takes to handle a hot vampire. I replied and added on, oh, and get back to the end of the line, you're not using me to skip to the front. I drove the rest of the way to the new house Maddox had put Cordelia and Rowena in, which was only 10 minutes away from the first one. This house was larger but had a quaint cottage feel to it, like Grandma's, only this house wasn't nestled in the middle of the forest. When I arrived, only Cordelia and Brianna were here, both sitting on the front porch swing and talking amicably. Tossing the pastry bag with the bear claw over the railing and onto Brianna's lap, I chuckled when her delighted squeal pierced my ears. I don't think either of you would appreciate if I threw this over. I chuckled, handing her the iced caramel macchiato she claimed to have dreamed of 3 times this week. Where's Rowena? Caffeine and sugar, that's my magic. She licked her lips and made a beeline straight for the front door. Knowing her, she was ready to nestle into the coziest sitting space and dive in. "She's at your sister's," Cordelia called out from over her shoulder and vanished down the hall for a few moments, dragging a golden-plated trunk as she returned. She let it fall to the floor with a thud, and I noticed there weren't any latches on it or a seam for that matter. Before I could ask how to open the thing, she knelt and placed her palm flat against the leather top. Where there had been nothing, not even the smallest of scuffs, a circular sigil glowed beneath her hand. It was etched into the leather of the trunk but was completely invisible until she placed a hand against it. "This is a type of protection sigil. It acts as a lock. Whoever's blood is used to make it, that's the person it will unlock for," she answered helpfully, propping the lid up against the foot of the couch. At first, I wasn't sure what I could accomplish without having access to my magic. When Cordelia placed a leather-bound book 2 times the size of my head onto my lap, I knew I was going to eat my words. "It's my largest book of sigils to date. Flip through it, take notes and memorize all that you can. Take heed if you ever plan to use these. One small mistake can change the purpose of a sigil. Draw a slash when you should have drawn a line. That's the difference between a protection sigil and one that sets fire to the unlucky soul that touches it." I could taste the warning in her words, and felt it mix with the rush of excitement I felt as I thumbed through the thick pages. An hour passed with the speed of a few minutes, and even though I could hear Brianna and Cordelia chatting in the background, my mind was utterly silent. A tornado of symbols and words, dots and slashes that had no meaning unless they were combined in just the right order. Many of the descriptions were vague enough to leave me confused and just a bit apprehensive. Start a fire, create a large wave, vanish from sight, curse an enemy with blindness. Some were more complex than others, and even required potions or spells to be performed on certain days of the month. Ingredients I had no knowledge of, along with some more common plants I had seen a time or two in Grandma's garden. When my stomach began snarling for something more than a couple of pastries and caffeine, I decided to take a break. Cordelia sang under her breath as she walked into the kitchen and rummaged through the newly stocked fridge. Brianna had brought a trunk full of groceries since the refrigerator at the previous house was stockpiled with random herbs and bottles of suspicious liquids. Brianna and I wandered a few minutes later and got to work with helping Cordelia cook. Like Grandma, the kitchen was Cordelia's element, just in a different way. Still, she graciously let us help even though we made our fair share of messes. Through the jokes and giggles, somewhere along the way we had gotten to talking about my mom and this mess with the magical block. Maybe there's a memory sigil that'll zap those bad boys back to the surface. I found it refreshing how Brianna always remained optimistic, even though she had her own battles she was fighting. Unfortunately, it was Cordelia's soft-spoken words that had to dash my hopes. "I'm afraid there's no such thing. There's sigils for just about everything, but not for that." She shook her head, making her long braid swish. "If you don't remember getting that block put on you, chances are those memories were erased. Erasing a memory is doable but incredibly risky, even a skilled wizard is going to be hesitant. There's too much potential to erase something important or worse, create a domino effect that damages the brain and leaves the person a shell of their former selves. If your mom took this route, then there's a reason she didn't want you to remember." Join our Facebook and WhatsApp group for more updates, link is given in description. Rest audiobook will be continued in next episode.